Yeah, thank you for the introduction. That's what I look like in a different bow tie. I'm going to go through a little bit of background, some rate limiting parameters that have been agreed on, and some behavior expectations, and then get into some examples. A big thing to remind everybody is that this is actually not a complete TP, and it's still in development. And I think that things can change, and also I'd invite more attendance and more shaping of this. We want to make sure it'll work. For example, there's been some good shaping to make sure we put in an infrastructure that'll be extensible to the NVMe over fabrics. So good input, continued discussion, and please join it. So implementing QoS in real SSDs is really what I would say for quality of service. It's externalizing a sharing of stored data access, and it's really focused on that data access and managing the performance, right? So the performance aspects of reaching that stored data inside of an SSD. So we might have, for example, several users here, and there might be several expectations on a maximum performance that might be allowed. Yep. So this first user has a setting of 50 megabits per second, and then we have 25K IOPS for a different user, and we have later I show a user with a more complex maximum settings here. So there's many different users, many different types of allocation requirements, and we have a total bandwidth, total IOPS, write bandwidth, and write IOPS. Within an SSD, though, we have a lot of different components that can potentially be a bottleneck. And I'm showing Brainstorm's list here, but sometimes they'll be over-provisioned for different workloads, and sometimes they might transiently be a bottleneck. Various different scenarios can happen within a real SSD as the users change their workload, and also the settings of what's being provided ends up being changed as well. So those potentially different constraints can really be a problem, and the reality is, as an SSD designer, we really want to put in and size things correctly. We don't really want to over-design and put in a pool of extra resources. We're not going to make as much money then, right? So the fact that we have a shared SSD, we're expecting, if we're doing our jobs right, we're going to be close on hitting a few bottlenecks by design and on purpose. So there's this idealized goal of a QoS communicating a media access target, but the reality is that we're going to have a lot of different things that interfere with that and might be detectable in end cases and certain scenarios. And that's acknowledged, and that's still the situation that we're going to move forward with. In order to implement QoS, I give an example here where potentially you could use a token bucket scheme in order to implement rate limiting. They're not a required implementation, but it's helpful to have one picture of one method. And actually, before I get into it, the note is some people are more familiar with the leaky bucket. You can translate between the two. These are just examples here. So if we were to start with a bucket containing an available number of tokens, and we have those tokens replenished every delta of time, then we'll get more tokens available and get replenished. Eventually, you can reach an excess tokens and they would overflow, right? So if there's a tenant that were idle, then that tenant cannot over-accumulate tokens in this example here. When we have a tenant come in, there will be a command. It consumes some amount of tokens. The amount of available tokens for later commands goes away. That command proceeds on. So it kind of paid that cost in the tokens and consumed them and moved on. If you have a lot of commands with SSDs and storage in general, there might be a lot of commands that come in and they don't have enough tokens to proceed through the system. And we, as a storage device, in networking, they can drop traffic. But in storage devices, we have a command, we're still going to need to service it. So we want to make sure that we're calling that out. So when you compare and contrast networking terminology to storage terminology, we're looking at traffic policing. And that is the phrase where we're not going to drop any commands or packets here. And then also, we're allowing the possibility of, here's a partial command progression where some of the command is moving forward. So this kind of variation is allowed. No requirements to actually implement it or to not implement it one way or the other. Another QoS parameter that we end up talking about is so we had the total read, total bandwidth, total IOPS, and then we had the write bandwidth and the write IOPS. So one more parameter is the hard and soft rate limits and what they mean. So from a controller perspective, there's QoS rate limits that are applied to that controller. If those QoS rate limits for that particular controller are hard, then this is the normal scenario that is very easy to understand. It's earlier I had an example that said 50 megabytes per second. You will follow that that controller is only allocated 50 megabytes a second. And it's very simple and intuitive for hard. For soft rate limits, they're sort of the same, but when there's idle resources available within the drive, then this particular controller in that situation is allowed to consume all the idle resources, which can be more efficient usage of the SSD. So one might say, is soft rate limiting the same as no rate limiting? And no, they aren't the same. And part of the reason is because they are the settings on that soft rate limit controller is going to have relative weighting. So when you have potentially, again, there's an SSD with many different resources, when one particular resource is in contention and there's trying to get access, two different controllers are getting access to it for their stored data, then there's that weighting that is compared for the hard versus the soft, and the win rate could be approximated through that weighting comparison. So soft rate limits really come up and they're most noticeable when an SSD is fully or overutilized. That's where you'll most notice that difference. So with these rate limits, I wanted to go through here, and I have some examples that we'll walk through and how they might actually be implemented in an SSD. So I continue to use here 3 tenants that are accessing one SSD through 3 different controllers. So the rate limits are applied to each controller, and I wanted to make the math simple. So we have an SSD capable of 100 megabytes per second, and all of the tenant bandwidth settings are at 50 megabytes per second. When we talk about a correctly prescribed SSD, this is where perhaps tenant 3 is idle. So it has a setting of 50 megabytes per second, but it's not actually sending any commands to the drive. Then tenant 1 and tenant 2 can achieve 50 megabytes per second each. And so this is exactly consuming that SSD's capabilities in this example. An underprescribed SSD is where all the tenants are active, but all 3 of them are consuming only a small queue depth, very small amount of bandwidth from the drive. So they're allocated and allowed up to 50 megabytes per second, but they aren't actually requesting that with their active queue depth. So when there's an SSD resource conflict, the tenants will arbitrate those resources with equal weighting, and basically they'll end up taking turns. I see a question.
So you say equal weighting there, but I haven't seen anything that says that it has to be equal weighting. Is it, I mean, would it be a compliant implementation if it was not equal weighting? If the 2 of the tenants got all of their allocated bandwidth and one of them was starved out? Not desirable, but would that be compliant?
So I think that the draft wording of the TP isn't complete. So I think that I'm not sure that I can predict an answer for that fully. But I think, Yes, whether we need to set with an expectation within NVMe, I think, is a question as well. Allowing variation in implementation can be useful sometimes. So I'm not certain that NVMe will dictate a behavior on that particular problem case there. Good question. Thank you. Another example, I'm continuing with 3 tenants, each with the settings of allowed 50 megabytes per second, but now it's an overprescribed SSD, right? They're all 3 allowed to have 50 megabytes per second, and coincidentally, we hit a situation where they all have a high queue depth. They're all requesting at their 50 megabytes per second, or perhaps they're even requesting more, and they would actually be capped at 50 megabytes per second. But when we have these 3 tenants here, we could have an expectation here that 33 megabytes per second for each of the tenants is a reasonable expectation there. And now to get into a little bit of descriptions for the hard and soft rate limits. So I have a related example here. And so now we have tenant 3 with hard rate limits, and I'm changing tenant 1 and 2 are using now 20 megabytes per second. That's what they're actually sending as a continuous queue depth and requesting their what kind of performance they're requesting out of that drive. So relatively low, but continuous requests for performance. Tenant 3 has a very high queue depth. It's effectively infinity, right? It's wanting more than the 50 megabytes per second allocated. And so with this example, there's available, and they would get capped at 50 megabytes per second. Same tenant, but now we switch over to soft rate limits. Now we're going to allow that tenant 3 to flow up and get 80 megabytes per second for the performance, right? So this is one example providing a little bit of understanding more on what that hard versus soft behavior expectations would be. But when those resources are contended, we would expect that there's some equal weighting between those examples. I think that taking those examples and now applying them to some real-life scenarios and stop being so abstract is helpful. So I put in here an example of applying QoS to live migration. This is certainly not the only time you'll have QoS, but it helps provide a little bit of a bigger picture understanding here. So we have a SSD capable of the same 100 megabytes per second. All the tenants are 50 megabytes per second with hard rate limiting. But now we have this parent, and that parent is also going to be a tenant, but I'm calling it out as special. And it's of course, the one that's going to do the administrations. But it is trying to do a migration. So it's trying to take one of these tenants and move it off the SSD, or perhaps moving in a new tenant. And so it has a setting of 1 megabyte per second, super low, and it has a setting of a soft rate limiting. That parent might have a continuously high queue depth where it's trying to migrate the traffic into the drive or out of the drive, but it's only got that 1 megabytes per second. So with all of the tenants active, just as before, the 3 tenants are all achieving their 33 megabytes per second, and the parent is going to achieve piddly nothing traffic, right? So less than 1 megabyte per second, it's going to get throttled down. It's not successfully getting very much through that system in this extreme example. But when the tenants are all idle, that same parent will be allowed to consume the entire drive, right? So that now we have 100 megabytes per second anytime the tenants drop in their traffic. And so this is great because it's going to provide a good quality of service and performance for those tenants when they are requesting it, but we're still maximizing the ability of that parent to move the data in and out of that drive for migrations. And then, of course, if there's ever a time where a tenant starts sending in traffic, they would be expected to, from a weighting perspective, we would expect them to win those resources very aggressively, right? In comparison to the parents. So overall, I went through and talked about when a host is enabling QoS in an SSD, there's several rate limit parameters there already that are agreed upon. those rate limits are going to be in measurable units. I focused on examples with megabytes per second and IOPS, so real-world measurable units. But they also are going to serve as a weighting ratios in immediate resource contentions. Under overprescribed SSDs, you should see that difference in behavior. And then I gave a bunch of examples. So I welcome everybody to come help shape where QoS actually ends up being finalized and provide some good directions there. So I welcome any questions, and that's it for me. Thank you.